Yeah. So yesterday, so there is no instances in the EC2, US East 1, North Virginia, right? There is no EC2 instances. These two are what these two are, guys? What these two are? What these two are? Worker node 1 and worker node 2. These two are worker nodes. Okay. These two are the worker nodes. So what you deployed the EKS. Deployed the EKS. Okay. So what this is? This is the EKS. Blue JTech. So Blue JTech cluster 4 is the EKS. What is the cluster information? The cluster information is API server endpoint and that resources. So the resources, there is no pods, compute engine. Okay. So in this node group, so a node group is created. This is a node group name equal to NG. Okay. Networking. This is the VPC. These are the subnets for security, cluster security group, itself security groups. So these are like the ADAPs, metric server. Metric servers means so how we can get the metrics, code DNS, Amazon VPC, CNA, group proxy. These all are the add-ons and these all are activated. These all are activated, right? Yeah. So this is the ECS. What ECS, guys? Amazon. So Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service. This is our cluster. EKS cluster is Blue Chetak cluster 4. So who will taken care by this will be taken care by the AWS team. This will be taken care by the AWS team. Okay. This is the console settings and these are the dashboard settings. Okay. You see guys, EKS control plane, worker nodes, forget pods, EKS anywhere and EKS hybrid nodes. So the pricing you can learn it from here. The pricing you can learn it from here. Okay. Yeah. So where we deployed our host mission. So we deployed our host mission, remote host mission in the EC2 instance. Right. So this is the EC2 instance. So this is remote in EC2 instance. So you can connect this to remote EC2 instance. So this is the public IP 40. This is public IP address, SSH auth, credentials, browser. So this is the private key and appearance, change, bold, 18, okay, open. Okay. What is this guys? So Ubuntu, Ubuntu is the user. Okay, kubectl get pods. Kubectl get pods. So one pod is running. Okay, kubectl get nodes. Kubectl get nodes. So these are the two worker nodes, but we don't know this pod is running on the which worker node. Inside the pod there is a container is running, but this pod is running under the so which node? How do you know? kubectl get pods hyphen go wide hyphen go wide. My Tomcat is running 23 hours ago. IP address. So what is the IP address? 192. 168 to 42.96. So, in which node this is created? This is created under the 253. This worker node, the pod is created. This worker node, the pod is created. So how it will create? It will create through the kubelet. Kubelet will inform to the API server and scheduler and the control manager. So then that Kubernetes Docker Docker engine will create the container, will create the pod worker node, inside the worker node, right? This container having which IP address? This container having this IP address. This IP address. So, right. Yeah. So, pod we can create. Why? So pod is the smallest building block in Kubernetes cluster. In Kubernetes cluster, every container will be created inside the pod only. Pod always runs inside the node. Pod represents running process. Pod means group of containers running on node. So we can create multiple pods on a single node. Every pod will have unique IP address. So we can create the pods in two ways: interactive approach and the declarative approach. So in the declarative approach, what is that? Kubernetes manifest file. Through the Kubernetes manifest file, so we can create the pod. The Kubernetes manifest file, so we can create the pod. Inside the pod. Right, one second. Yeah. So you understood the how to display the node pod. So pod using pod manifest file. Describe the pod we discussed yesterday, right? Pod logs. Get pods running on which worker node we need to discuss. We discussed on this. Discussed. So what is that? So we need to access. So while creating the container, so we access this container or we access this container through browser. But pods we cannot access outside. Pot pods we cannot access whites outside. Why pod? Why this pod we cannot access outside? So we need to expose the pods for the outside accessing using Kubernetes called as a service concept. Which concept is service concept? We need to expose pods for outside access using Kubernetes service concept. Which one, guys? Service. By default, by default, Kubernetes doesn't that pod doesn't have the outside outward. It does not expose the outside. How it will be exposed? It will expose through the concept called as a the service concept. What is that? Not pods. Pods we can't access outside. Access outside, right? Pods we cannot access outside. So if you want to access the pod, we need to expose pods for outside access. See, Kubernetes service concept. So we need to expose pods for outside using Kubernetes service concept. Which concept, guys? Service concept. By default, pod doesn't have exposed the outside, But if you want to expose this pod, definitely we need a service. We need a service, right? Understood, right? So how we can expose? I'm checking. So right, public DNS through the public DNS, HTTPS colon double slash or HTTP colon double slash. What is the pod you exposed, guys? 80 port, right? Let's see. 80 port or a public IP address. You will take the public IP address. HTTP colon double slash colon 18. See guys, site cannot be reached because of so pod by default, so it will not expose outside of the network. If you want to expose outside of the network, what you need, you need a you need a service. We need to expose pods for outside access using Kubernetes. So we need a service concept. Which concept we need, guys? The service concept. So why we don't expose the pod directly? So pods, so pods we cannot access outside. So right, why we don't expose a pod directly? So why we need to why we don't expose the pod directly? What are those guys? Pod is a dynamic pod IP. Pod IP is dynamic. It will changes automatically. Pod can be recreated anytime. Okay. Pod can be recreated anytime. Pod can be recreated anytime. So no load balancing. There is no load balancing. There is no load balancing and not a production safe. What is that? Not a production, not a production safe base. So what is that? So why we don't expose the pod directly? Pod IP is dynamic. Pod can be reached anytime. No load balancing, not a production safe. Right. So we need to expose the pods for outside access using Kubernetes, concept called as a service. Concept called as a service. So it will expose the pods outside. It will expose the pods outside. Yes, understood. So what is the concept, guys? The concept is Kubernetes A8S service concept. This concept will expose the pods outside. Kubernetes service is used to expose pods outside of the cluster. Outside of the cluster. So we have three types of Kubernetes services. So we have a three types of services. So one is cluster IP. Second one is second one is node port. What is that, guys? Second one is the node port, and third one is so. What is the third one, guys? Third one is load balancer. What is the third one, guys? Third one is load balancer. So how many ways? So we have three types of Kubernetes services: cluster IP, node port, and load balancer. Cluster IP, load port, and so load balancer. We need to write the service manifest file to expose the pods. To expose the pods, right? So by default pod having the cluster IP. Pod having the cluster IP. So cluster IP is nothing but a so cluster IP it will expose within the cluster only. It will pod will expose within the cluster, but outside it will not expose. So by default pod having the cluster IP, that is the reason. So it is not exposing the outside of the network. So if you want to expose the outside, so what are the two services? The two services are node port and the load balancer. So if you want to expose multiple pods, you can use load balancer. If you want to expose only one pod, you can use the node port. You can use the node port, right? So if you want to expose the pods, if you want to expose the pods outside, you need to use the node port. If so, one pod you can use the node port. Multiple pods you can use the load balancer. What is that? One pod. So one pod we can use the node port, and the multiple pods you can use the multiple pods. We can use the load balancer concept. So this is exposes only inside the cluster. Pod by default having cluster IP. Pod by default having the cluster IP. By default it exposes only inside the cluster. That's the reason it's a cluster IP. It's a cluster IP. So we can see service information on node port number assigned by the Kubernetes, right? How you can create the one second. Okay, so load balancer, cluster IP, node port, and load balancer. So cluster IP, it will expose inside the cluster. Node port, it will expose outside, but only one part. If you want to expose multiple parts, you can use the load balancer. You can use the load balancer. We need to write the service manifest YAML file to expose the parts. So what this is for creating the this is for creating the pod. You want to expose this pod, you need to create the kind service. You need to create the another manifest file for the service manifest file. Right. We need to write a service manifest YAML to expose parts. So we need to write the service manifest YAML to expose the parts. So how to write the service manifest file? Service. So service manifest file. So how to write the service manifest file? How to write the service manifest file? The same way how you can write the pod manifest. The same way you can write the service manifest. Can write the service manifest file, or else we can take it from here. Okay. So ls cat simple pod.aml. What this is, guys? So this is the AML file, simple AML file for the pod. Now we will create the simple AML file for the service. What is that? Service. Service. So metadata. What is that? So my tomcat svc. Okay. So what is the name? And you need to provide the name equal to svc. You need to remove that labels. Okay. Spec. Spec. In the spec, you need to provide the 1 second. One second, please. Documents. Docs. Okay. One second, guys. Documents. నెంబర్ కావాలా ఏంటి? Understood? So what this is spec, no need spec in the spec. So we just expose the pod only, right? Port, so we will remove everything here. Meta name SVC spec also. Okay. So type. What is the type, guys? Type is node port. What is node port? Node port is nothing but it is a only one pod, right? We just use the node port, and we can use the select. What is that? Selector. Why selector? So we need to specify the label. In the selector, we need to specify the labels, right? You need to specify the labels from the selector. You can selector, you can specify the app. App is, what is the app, guys? My Tomcat 9 is the label. The whatever the label name, right? We need to select the, so the label's name will be selected in the selector. The label's name will be added in the selector.
అడ్మిన్ కన్సోల్ నా దాంట్లో పెట్టేసేయాలా అథెంటికేషన్ మీకు ప్రొవైడ్ చేయాలా?
మాకే ప్రొవైడ్ చేయండి.
మీకే ప్రొవైడ్ చేయాలా? ఎందుకంటే ఎప్పుడు యూజర్స్ యాడ్ చేయాలన్నా, లాగిన్ చేయాలన్నా కంపల్సరీ మైక్రోసాఫ్ట్ అథెంటికేటర్ అది కీ చెప్తేనే మేము లాగిన్ చేసుకునేకి అవుతది. మీకే ప్రొవైడ్ చేయాలా?
ఇది నాకు మంచి ఉంటుంది.
సరే అది ఆన్‌లో పెట్టేసుకోండి. క్యూఆర్ కోడ్ రాగానే జస్ట్ యాక్టివేట్ చేసేస్తాను. ₹974 ₹750 అది సబ్స్క్రిప్షన్‌ది. విత్ జీఎస్టీ ₹974 అవుతా ఉంది. ఒక స్టాండర్డ్ యూజర్‌కి. ఎంత? ₹974 స్టాండర్డ్ యూజర్. ఇంకా మామూలుగా 250 ఉంది కదా! అది విత్ జీఎస్టీ అది నేను చెప్తాను. యూజర్స్ యాడ్ చేసినప్పుడు చెప్తాను.
What is that, guys? My Tomcat 9. So what is that? So my Tomcat 9 is the label here. What is the label, guys? The label equal to my Tomcat 9. Label equal to, so my Tomcat 9 in the selector. So why we need to provide the selector? Because of this node port will be assigned to which pod. This node port IP will be assigned to which pod. So that will be selected by the selector. In the selector, we need to provide the label name for the pod. Guys, remember this word. Label name for the pod. Okay. So the next ports. What are the ports are enabled? What are the ports are enabled? Hyphen port 80. Okay, port 80 and the target port also. Target port, the target ports also 80. The target port also 80. So this is nothing but a service manifest file. This is nothing but a service manifest file. So you can create the, so you can create the manifest file. So both or you can create the, or you can create the GitLab. You can create it as a one file. You can create it as a one file. I will show you that. Okay, one it is. Okay. So load balancer. So this is the load balancer. So pod my tomcat label equal to my tomcat spec. So this is comes from the our Docker hub. So API server kind equal to service, right? If you want to create both are in one file, what you need to add? You need to add the three icons. You need to add the three icons. If you want to add another kind another service, so you just add the, so add the three icons. You just add the three icons. Okay. What this is? This is the load balancer, right? So here we need to set it as a node port. Yes, understood? So here we need to set the spec type of load balancer or node port. Okay. So if it is a load balancer, the load balancer will be created. The automatically load balancer will be created. Okay. So VI simple pod and SVC dot ML. So VI simple pod SVC dot ML. So right in this you can create the pod manifest file and the service manifest file in the one manifest file. Okay, whatever the label, right? So this pod, which pod? So this pod needs to set the what is that load balancer or node port IP. How it will expose the outside? We need to set the service. So what this is? This is the node port. So node port. Now, if you want to expose only one pod, you can use the node port. If you want to expose multiple, you can use the load balancer. You can use the load balancer. Guys, understood? So what this is a simple pod svc.aml. Simple pod svc.aml. Understood, right? And, ట్రై చేస్తానంట కాకపోతే క్రెడిట్ తో ఇస్తాను మరి డెబిట్ తో ట్రై మేడం అడుగు ఒకసారి మేడం. Okay. So how many pods are running? kubectl get pods. Look, I want to delete this pod. kubectl delete pod name. What is the pod name, guys? My tomcat. Okay. kubectl get pods. Get pods. Okay. There is no pod. So cat simple pod svc.ml. So for this, it will create the pod as well as it will assign the IP address to this node port IP address to this pod. Then it will expose the pod in the outside. Then it will expose the pod in the outside. Right? Yeah. Let's see. So, so display existing services. How to display the existing services? kubectl get SVC, get pods, get SVC for service, get SVC. So Kubernetes cluster IP. So what is that type of service? So cluster IP is created. Cluster IP is created. Now kubectl apply -f for simple pod svc.ml. Yeah, you see, pod my tomcat is created, service my tomcat also created. Now check kubectl get svc. So right, there is a node port is created. Node port is created. Right. So we can see the service information and node port number assigned by Kubernetes. Right. So the service information is node port and the IP is 10.100.202.240. Right. 240. Is understood? So what is the node port? Node port is in the let's see. So where it will created? kubectl get pods hyphen. Oh, wide. So right. So in which EC2 instance? 253 EC2 instance. So in this instance, we need to enable the 8080 port in this security group. In the security group. Okay, the missions are in the North Virginia 253, right? What is that? Instance is 253. 192.168.53. 253. This IP address of the server 105. Okay. Connect to this EC2 instance. Go to the security and the security group for this inbound all traffic all destination all routes. Edit inbound rules. Yeah. All traffic custom 000 anything, save the rule, or else you can add a specific port number 8080 here. Okay, then what you can do, enable the port number in the security group of a worker node in which pod our pod in which our pod is running. So access application URL in the browser. So how you can access http colon double slash, so node public IP node. What is the public IP of this node? Instances. Details. Public IP 152 to 3275. Okay. Colon 80. This site cannot be reached. Mhm. One second, guys. Into Docker Hub. మ్యూట్లో పెట్టాను ఇప్పటిదాకా. Yeah. So guys understood, we have added the port, container port and host port. So by using 30362 lab 6a, so input.form. So this is our application is deployed in the Kubernetes and access in the outside of the network. How it will access this website, guys? Through the service node port. Guys understood? Guys understood? Huh?
యాహ్! యాహ్! ఒకసారి ఆ ఇమేజ్ చూపిస్తారా? ఎక్కడి నుంచి అది అప్లికేషన్‌ని పుల్ చేసుకుంటుంది అని?
ఇది
లైక్ ఇన్‌సైడ్ పాడ్
hmm,
లైక్ మీరు రెపో యూఆర్ఎల్ ఇచ్చుంటారు కదా! రెపో యూఆర్ఎల్ ఆర్ ఇమేజ్ బేస్ ఇమేజ్ ఒకసారి అది
describe.
ఆ! హ్మ్.
QCTL describe. అది పెడదాం కదా ఆల్రెడీ ఓపెన్ చేయి ఆల్రెడీ అది.
ఇంకొకటి
ఉమ్,
ఇప్పుడు నా కంపెనీ జిఎస్టీ బేస్ మీద రిజిస్టర్ అయిపోయింది.
ఉమ్,
ఓకేనా?
ఉమ్.
ప్రతిరోజు బిల్స్ అన్ని నాకు ప్రొవైడ్ చేయాల్సి వస్తుంది మంత్లీ.
అందుకనే నేను వద్దు డిలీట్ చేయని చెప్తున్నాను.
నువ్వు డిలీట్ చేసే కాదు,
ఉమ్,
యాడ్ చేసేసాను,
ఉమ్,
కన్ఫర్మ్ అయిపోయింది.
ఉమ్,
మరి మీరు జిఎస్టీ చేయించుకోవాల్సి వస్తుంది
ఉమ్,
కంపల్సరీ.
ఉమ్,
అప్పుడు కావాల్సింటే రిలీజ్ చేసేస్తాను.
సరే.
ఏమంటే నాకు ప్రతి మంత్ నాకు బిల్స్ మాత్రం ప్రొవైడ్ చేయండి.
ఉమ్,
మీకు ఈ మెయిల్కి వస్తుంది బిల్,
ఉమ్,
ఆ మెయిల్ నుంచి నా మెయిల్ ఫార్వర్డ్ చేసేయండి చాలు.
ఉమ్,
ఎందుకంటే నేను ఈ చార్టెడ్ అకౌంట్స్ కి సబ్మిట్ చేయాలి
ఉమ్.
అట్లా.
ఎందుకంటున్నా అలా ఎందుకు డిలీట్ చేయ డిలీట్ చేయ
డిలీట్ చేస్తే మీకు అకౌంట్ యాక్టివేట్ కాదు అది.
ఉమ్,
ఇప్పుడు ప్రెసెంట్ నా అకౌంట్ యాక్టివేట్ అయింది.
ఉమ్,
మీరు తర్వాత మళ్ళీ జిఎస్టీ క్రియేట్ చేయించుకుంటారేమో చేయించుకోండి,
ఉమ్,
అది కాంపోజిట్ అయినా చేయించుకోండి,
ఉమ్,
ప్రాబ్లం ఏం లేదు.
ఉమ్,
అది అయిపోయిన తర్వాత మీరు ఎడిట్ చేసి దాంట్లో యాడ్ చేస్తాను.
ఉమ్.
దాని తర్వాత ఇంకా నాకు సంబంధం
ఎడిట్
ఉండదు.
చేయడానికి ఉంది.
ఉందా?
మీరు
సరే ఉంచు.
ప్రెసెంట్ ప్రెసెంట్ నాకు బిల్స్ ఫార్వర్డ్ కావాలా,
ఓకేలే.
ఎందుకంటే అకౌంట్ డీటెయిల్స్ అన్ని నావే ఉంటాయి.
ఉమ్,
జిఎస్టీ అకౌంట్ డీటెయిల్స్ అన్ని దీంట్లో పాన్
ఉమ్,
కార్డ్ అవన్నీ.
ఉమ్,
ఎవరు పర్చేస్ చేశారా అంటే నా కంపెనీ వస్తుంది
ఉమ్.
అట్లా.
ఓకే ఓకే చూడు.
ఎడిట్ ఉంది కాబట్టి ప్రాబ్లమ్ లేదు. ఎడిట్ లేకపోతే
మరి తర్వాత ఎడిట్ చేసుకోవచ్చు.
ఉమ్,
చేసుకున్నప్పుడు మీది రిజిస్టర్ అయిపోయిన తర్వాత ఎడిట్ చేసి యాక్టివేట్ చేస్తాను.
సరే.
ఇప్పుడు మీ మొబైల్ ఇవ్వండి, అది కాన్ఫిగర్ చేయాలి.
సో node 250 253 and the label equal to Tomcat. Okay, status is running. The IP address of this pod is 192.168.36.6. Okay, so and the container my Tomcat, this is the container is running. This is the Docker ID. The port is 8080 in the TCP and host equal to TCP. It is running. Okay.
డైరెక్ట్ డాకర్ హబ్ నుంచి బేస్ ఇమేజ్ పుల్
పుల్ చేసుకుంటుంది. ఇది డాకర్ హబ్ నుంచి ఇచ్చామన్నమాట మనం.
ఓకే.
సో సో దిస్ ఈస్ డిఫాల్ట్ స్కెడ్యూలర్ అండ్
మరి ఇప్పుడు
క్యూబ్లెట్
మీరు రెపో యూఆర్ఎల్ ఇచ్చారు కదండీ! అది డాకర్ ఇమేజ్‌కి ఇచ్చిన రెపో యూఆర్ఎలా? అంటే మీరు నేమ్ స్లాష్ టామ్‌క్యాట్ 9 అని ఇచ్చారు కదా పైన.
అది ఇదే.
ఓకే.
సో నా రిపోజిటరీ నేమ్ ఏంటిది? గిట్‌హబ్ లో హరికృష్ణ 8 అపాచీ వెబ్ ఆర్ టామ్ క్యాట్ 9. సో ఇది హరికృష్ణ, ఇది నా నేమ్ అన్నమాట, నా రిపోజిటరీ. సో ఇది నా టామ్ క్యాట్ 9 అనేది అప్లికేషన్, నా డాకర్ ఇమేజ్. సో ఇక్కడ నుంచి పుల్ చేసుకుంటుంది.
ఓకే.
ఇక్కడ ఏమైనా స్పెసిఫై చేసావా డాకర్ ఇమేజ్? ఇక్కడ
ఇమేజ్ స్పేస్‌లో స్పెక్‌లో యూజ్ చేశారు.
స్పెక్ లో కంటైనర్ లో నాకు ఏ కంటైనర్ క్రియేట్ అవ్వాలంటే ఈ టామ్ క్యాట్ 9 కంటైనర్ క్రియేట్ అవ్వాలి. నాకు ఏ డాకర్ ఇమేజ్ తీసుకోవాలంటే నా డాకర్ హబ్ నుంచి తీసుకోవాలి. ఆర్ ఎల్స్ మీ దగ్గర అయితే ఆర్టిఫాక్టరీ, జేఫాగో, నెక్సెస్ అక్కడ నుంచి తీసుకుంటాం.
ఏసీఆర్ కూడా సమ్ టైమ్స్ యూజ్ చేయొచ్చా అండి? లేకపోతే ఎలా అంటే
దేనికి?
ఏసీఆర్ నుంచి పిక్ చేసుకోదా? ఏసీఆర్‌లో ఒకవేళ ఇమేజెస్ ఉన్నాయనుకోండి, అక్కడి నుంచి ఏమన్నా
ఈసీఆర్ ఎలాస్టిక్ కంటైనర్ సర్వీసా?
హ్మ్. ఈసీఆర్
ఈసీఆర్
గానీ, ఈసీఆర్ కానీ అందులో
ఎలాస్టిక్
ఇమేజెస్ స్టోర్ చేసుకోవచ్చా మనం?
అవును, అక్కడ నుంచి కూడా పుష్ చేసుకోవచ్చు. సో ఫర్
ఓకే.
ఎగ్జాంపుల్ deployment only file Kubernetes from ECR. Your ECR URL and image name.
అక్కడ
tag.
పాత్ ఇవ్వాలి ఇమేజ్‌ది.
Hmm.
ఓకే.
Understood?
హ్మ్. యాహ్! యాహ్!
Or else from JFrog artifactor. So artifact URL, repository name, image name, tag.
హ్మ్.
Okay?
యాహ్!
Okay. Understood? So now service. Now you understood the service. Tomorrow I will show you load balancer also. Tomorrow I will show you load balancer and right. So now you understood how to connect through the remote machine. So tomorrow I will show you how to connect through the open lens also. Okay?
హ్మ్.
Hmm?
యాహ్! అది ఇంకొకటి ఆహ్, మీరు
Hmm.
టాక్ ఏదో
Hmm.
షేర్ చేస్తానన్నారు కదండీ! అదేమన్నా ఉంటే?
అది షేర్ చేస్తాను నేను.
హ్మ్.
సరే.